My name is Tim Klingenberg. I'm part of the research project Making Landscape of the Ruhr-University Bochum in Germany, led by Professor Dr. Constanze von Rüden, which has been investigating the landscape on the island of SantAntioco, southwest of Sardinia, since 2017. My talk today focuses on the Nuragic period in Sardinia, and in particular on the tower-like structures known as Nuraghi. These monuments are important because they not only define a distinct chronological phase within the Bronze Age, but also strongly shape the surrounding landscape. Traditionally, Nuraghi have been interpreted as bastions or fortresses that controlled their territory. This led to the assumption of a hierarchical and militarized society. More recent research, however, has moved away from this strictly defensive interpretation. Alternative approaches suggest that the functions of these buildings were much more diverse and that societies may have been organized hierarchically rather than hierarchically. In my own work, I am especially interested in the perception of the landscape through these structures. To approach this question, I use both visual and acoustic perspectives, combining geographic information systems with fieldwork and sensory prospection. Before turning to my case study, let me briefly situate the Nuraghi in terms of the main types and their placement across Sardinia. Traditionally, scholars distinguish between three categories, shown here. The earliest, dating to around 1700 to 1500 BCE, are the so-called corridor Nuraghi with irregular ground plans and narrow passageways, shown in the top left. Around 1600 BCE, the single towers, or monotore, became the most widespread form. These conical towers, built with corbelled walls, could reach several stories in height and often contained niches or staircases, here in the bottom left. From about the same period onward, some of these monotore were expanded into complex Nuraghi, where the main tower was joined by smaller ones connected by walls to form some kind of stronghold. Looking at their distribution, we know now of more than 7,000 Nuraghi across Sardinia. They are rarely placed at random. Many occupy elevated positions, with wide visibility whether inland or along the coast. Interpretations differ. Some see them as markers of territorial control, others as connected to resources like arable land or water. But a striking point is that they often appear in clusters at intervals of 1 or 2 kilometers. This regularity suggests that their placement also created networks of visibility and perhaps communication, making communities present to one another in the landscape. It is precisely in this broader context that the island of SantAntioco becomes an interesting case. Its contained geography allows us to explore how Nuraghi may have worked together as part of such networks, through both visual and acoustic connections. Today it is connected to the main island by an isthmus, but it still forms a largely self-contained microregion. This makes it an excellent case study for landscape research. So far, at least 29 Nuragic sites have been documented on the island, providing a substantial basis for exploring patterns of visibility, audibility in the Bronze Age landscape. One of the central questions I ask in my ongoing PhD thesis is, how did the Bronze Age communities perceive and interact with the landscape through Nuraghi, and what roles did visibility and audibility play in this interaction? To address this, I combined several methods. First, I used geographic information systems to model both viewsheds and sound propagation, here as an example on the left. Second, I carried out on-site fieldwork to verify and refine these models. Here is a documentation sheet from on-site in the middle for the acoustics. And finally, I integrated sensory prospection, meaning that I tried to experience the landscape directly and phenomenologically around the canal plain of SantAntioco, here in the photographs on the right. The acoustic experiments were relatively straightforward. 2 people were involved, one remained at the Nuraghi, while the other moved in the 4 cardinal directions, each time in 50-meter increments. At each point, communication was attempted in different ways, by speaking in a normal voice with around 60 decibels, by shouting with about 80 decibels, and in one case we tried whistling, similar to the whistle language El Silbo Gomero on the Canary Islands. The results were documented in categories such as clearly audible, partly understandable, and not perceivable. These results were later compared with the GIS models. Let me turn to the results, starting with visibility. During my survey in the Kenai Plain, here in the middle, I recorded 29 nuraghi. Most of them are situated in elevated positions, overlooking the plain. The key finding here is that the Kenai Plain is visible from almost all towers. Only a few orient more strongly towards the coastline and the sea. When we combine all viewsheds together, as on the left, it becomes clear that nearly the entire plain and its surrounding hills were visually covered by the nuraghi. It has to be mentioned that the towers cannot be differentiated chronologically without an excavation. Importantly, the comparison between GIS models and the field observations was largely consistent. Of course, local factors such as vegetation or small terrain features created some differences, but overall coverage pattern was very robust. This suggests that the nuraghi collectively provided continuous visual surveillance both of inland farmland and of maritime approaches. The acoustic experiments produced complementary results. Normal conversation at around 60 decibels was generally audible up to 50, at some points 80 meters, depending on the conditions such as wind direction or obstacles. Here is a photo of the Bay of Maladroja. We heard the people visiting the beach there, which is about 300 meters away. The GIS predicted slightly larger ranges up to about 90 meters for 60 decibel, but these values were rarely achieved in practice. On the left side you can see in magenta and cyan the 60 decibel or spoken, and then yellowish to brown the 80 decibel. Shouting at over 80 decibels extended communication considerably, often reaching 200 meters or more. In several cases, the sound traveled especially well along the coastline and or across the plain. One interesting observation came from whistling. This sound impulse was perceptible over much longer distances, either speaking or shouting. While this does not prove Bronze Age communities used whistling as a means of communication, it shows that certain sound types are especially effective in this kind of environment. When we combine visibility and audibility, the picture becomes even clearer. Together, they provide almost complete coverage of the island. In some places where sightlines were blocked by hills or vegetation, for example in the Bay of Maladroja, the sound could reach further and could be heard. And in some other cases, where sound did not carry as far, visibility compensated the lack of thereof. This suggests that the nuraghi should not be understood as isolated monuments. Instead, they formed a network of sensory connections across the island, linking inland areas, coastal plains, and maritime routes. One particular striking case is the Nuragh Sega near Maladroja Bay. Here I brought with me a picture of the nuragh, where it's located on the LiDAR, the visibility analysis, and the sound shed. The view shed analysis shows that it is oriented directly towards the bay and possibly even across the Gulf of Palmas. Acoustic experiments also revealed strong sound propagation towards the shoreline. Later historical maps indicate that Maladroja was used as a harbor, and geomorphological studies have confirmed that the bay is well suited for anchorage. This raises the hypothesis that the nuragh played an important role in monitoring or communicating with seafaring activities. It may have functioned not only as a landmark, but also as a point of acoustic interaction with maritime traffic. If we consider the spacing of the nuraghi on SantAntioco, usually about 1 to 2 kilometers apart, the idea of a communication network becomes more plausible. At normal voice levels of 60 decibels, the ranges are too short, but by shouting or 80 decibels or other sound signals could extend communication across several hundred meters. Combined with the visibility, this creates the potential for a chain of interactions across the island. I brought with me 2 photos to make visually clear that the distances are not that far. So the one on the left hand side is the top photo, the top right arrow is the bottom left photography, and the bottom right photo is the bottom right arrow. This challenges the interpretation of Nuraghi as isolated bastions belonging to individual clans. Instead, the evidence that we gather in the project points towards a more communal system of shared interaction where the towers were part of an integrated landscape network. To conclude, the Nuraghi of SantAntioco were placed strategically to integrate both inland and maritime landscapes. Visual and acoustic analysis show that they complemented each other, together ensured almost complete coverage of the island. Individual case studies such as Segamateddu suggest that certain Nuraghi were directly engaged with seafaring and coastal communication. At the same time, the overall network arrangement points to communal interaction across the island rather than isolated territorial control. Beyond these spatial and communicative aspects, the study also highlights a broader point. Sound was not just a technical factor, but part of the lived experience of prehistoric communities. The effectiveness of certain sound types, such as whistling, raises the possibility that Bronze Age people may have developed specific acoustic practices, whether for coordination, signaling, or even ritualized forms of expression. Why does this matter? Because it changes the way we narrate Nuragic society. Instead of isolated militarized groups defending their own strongholds, the acoustic and visual connections suggest an integrated cooperative system. In this perspective, Nuraghi become not just monuments of power, but nodes in a sensory and social network. By integrating archaeoacoustics into the study of Nuragic landscapes, we are reminded that soundscapes represent an essential, though often overlooked dimension of the past. They allow us to connect practical communication with social and possible ritual contexts, and to ask how music and sound contributed to community life in Sardinia during the Bronze Age. This perspective not only enriches our understanding of Nuragic society, but also contributes to broader debates on the role of sound in shaping human interaction, identity, and landscape across prehistory. More generally, it reminds us that prehistoric landscapes were not silent backdrops, but living soundscapes, filled with communication, signaling, and perhaps even music. By listening for these dimensions, we open new avenues for understanding how communities experienced their environment and how sound fostered social cohesion, identity, and ritual practice. And with this, I would very much like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to engage in discussion and conversation about the topic that I just presented. Thank you.